Hello and welcome. This is the second of 3 webinars the Vermont Employee Ownership Center has organized to mark the day that would have been our annual conference had the whole COVID thing not happened. But we are, so this is kind of, this session is hot topics for ESOPs. So a discussion of a lot of the things that are afoot in the ESOP world and getting into just, both technical things and cultural things and other stuff like that. So we'll be starting with a presentation from Barbara Clough and Tabitha Crosscut to go through some of the stuff that they're seeing in the broader world, and then we'll open up the to questions. So there's both a Q&A thing that you can submit questions in writing, but also at the end, if you're interested in sort of joining the conversation with your video, you should be able to raise your hand virtually. And anyone who's got their hand raised when we enter the Q&A session, I'll kind of add your video to the mix. So without further ado, Barbara and Tabitha, do you want to introduce yourself and then we can go into your presentation? So maybe Tabitha, go first.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Tabitha Crosscut with Devine, Willamette, and Branch. I'm an ESOP lawyer working with companies throughout Vermont and across the US as well, getting lots of fun questions around the pandemic. But we're really happy to be able to share some of the hot topics with you today. Barbara?
Thanks, Tabitha. I'm Barbara Clough. I'm a director with Newport Group, and I work on all things administration with Vermont companies as well as nationwide. And happy to be joining the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, as well as Tabitha, to talk about some of the things we see just about every day.
All right, so Matt, I can screen share now?
Yep, go for it.
All right, so let's jump right in. So what Barbara and I have done is tried to figure out technology along the way here today. And my computer doesn't like me. So we put together a number of different topics that we've been hearing from companies about. Obviously, a lot of that in terms of hot topics is definitely around what companies can do in relationship to preparing for what is to come or things that they're experiencing currently with respect to maybe a dip in revenue or expected dip in revenue, and how that's going to impact the operations of each company's employee stock ownership plan, whether that's for the 2019 distributions that are occurring during 2020, or whether that might be for distributions that might be occurring in 2021. So lots of questions around distribution. And then, of course, Barbara and I try to also preempt some surprises that might occur at the end of this year. So we're going to walk through the agenda here, basically a slide for each of these, and just have a conversation around each of them. So we're going to talk about what potential payments companies might be able to delay, give you a little bit of insight on something called partial plan termination, jump into things that we don't typically think about on a day-to-day basis probably, but should be definitely thought about in this environment, which is the investment of non-company stock assets. If a company has other assets in their ESOPs, many companies don't. Allocation requirements that might need changing is worthy of considering. And then, of course, no hot topic webinar would be complete without touching on the PPP loan. So we are certainly not going to give you all the ins and outs of the PPP loan, but we felt like we just had to. You just can't go to a webinar, right, Barbara, without something
Right.
PPP loan. And then we'll definitely leave time at the end for some miscellaneous Q&A. Certainly if you all have questions that you want to focus on, we are here at your disposal. So moving quickly here on to distributions and payments that might be delayed. So just a spattering of things here in terms of different features of your plan that you might want to look at. We're getting sort of more into the year now, so I know many companies, and Barbara can certainly attest to this, many companies are in the midst of closing out allocations, and many are putting out their distribution forms and waiting for elections. So many of the hot topics of probably, I don't know, Barbara, what do you say, like 2 months ago, we were in the midst of interim valuation conversation.
Absolutely.
So those conversations have sort of changed now. Now it's sort of a company is generally, at least a December 31 plan year, has generally made the decision whether they're going to do some sort of interim valuation, which would impact distributions or not. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. So as we talk about sort of the distribution options that may be delayed, these might not be necessarily applicable to the current distribution calendar, because you're probably already amidst doing these things, and so you can't really change them midstream, but these might apply more to next year. So we definitely don't want to forget about the fact that for those companies that didn't do an interim valuation, and many did not, and that is absolutely fine, your 2019 stock value is obviously impacting all the distribution activity that is happening now, distributions, diversifications, but what about next year, right? And so you're gonna have to think ahead a little bit, think about what that 2020 year-end stock price will be, and you might want to tweak some things in the plan. It might be that for many companies, they are not seeing the revenue decline right now, but it might be more of a revenue impact as the year goes on. We just don't know. And so thinking about whether distribution policies should be shifted, you know, whether if you have lump sum in your plan, for example, right now, just as a matter of protecting company cash flow, you might want to change that to installments. And ESOPs do have the ability to change that distribution policy from year to year between installments and lump sum. So being able to sort of foresee that and change the plan or the distribution policy is one of those items that you really want to have some awareness of going into the next year. Some companies, you still sort of have the time to think about that potentially for this year. I don't know, Barbara, are you seeing a lot of changes on installment versus lump sum in your administration?
We are. A lot of plan sponsors who have typically paid out maybe installments with a minimum payment amount. So we're going to pay you in 5 substantially equal installments, but never less than, say, $10,000 or some other figure. They're really looking at that and saying, well, gee, you know, could we pay a $10,000 balance in 5 installments? And I think we're still seeing a lot of stock values coming in, Tabitha. So would you agree that if a plan sponsor hasn't received their stock value or completed their year-end administration, they still have time to think about these changes and maybe implement changes based on the 2019 year-end, or if they're
Definitely.
an off-calendar 2020?
Yep, absolutely. And I know there are still quite a few companies, and I'm sure you're seeing this, that are delaying their process a little bit, or may have just by just the impact of having to keep up with all the changes that were occurring the last few months have delayed their process just as a result of that. So there certainly can be plenty of those companies out there that have the ability to think about what this year's distributions might look like when they get that input from the third-party administrator. So absolutely.
Absolutely. We have a lot of clients who would typically have maybe paid people out by now. And because of, you know, working from home, delays in getting audited financials or other items, you know, have basically said, it's not that we're going to stop distributions, but we're just going to kind of change our cycle this year and maybe pay people out a little bit later in the year. And that's also giving them some time to really take a look at things, you know, especially in relation to the PPP that we'll get to later, and help with some of those decisions.
Exactly. So one of the related distribution items is going to be your cash out or force out distributions. So just as a little bit of background there, plans are permitted. So your plan doesn't necessarily have this feature, but every ESOP should take a look at this. If you have balances, vested balances in your terminated accounts during that administration process that are $1,000 or less, those amounts can be basically kicked out, right? You don't have to get the participants' consent. And a lot of plans that I work with definitely just force those balances out so that we can get rid of those little balances and not have to deal with them, not have to track people down. And so that's an automatic, right? And so thinking about that, I sort of think about it in terms of what's going to happen at the end of 2020, because our valuations at 12/31/19 were not necessarily impacted by the pandemic. So they might have been strong values, but as we look into 2020, you're going to have more companies who do see some revenue impacts and profitability impacts from the pandemic. And so the balances at 2019 may have been above that $1,000 threshold, but when you get to the end of 2020, you might find a larger number of those participant or terminated participant balances being at that 1,000 or under, which if you have quite a few of them can add up quickly. In addition to that, many plans will actually kick out between 1,000 and 5,000. So if the balance is between that 1,000 and 5,000 or whatever metric maybe within there, some plans I think are still using like the $3,000 high end on that. You can also cash out those balances for terminated accounts. You just have to transfer those funds into an IRA if you don't get consent. So the cash flow impact for the company as the sponsor of the plan is that if your plan says that you automatically kick out those balances, that means that in the 2021 process of going through administration, you could have a bigger bucket of those small balances based on a lower value in 2020. So what I'm suggesting to companies is that you should at least sort of take a look at that and determine whether you want to modify that provision in the plan so that you're not being forced to make those distributions in 2021. And that's generally what I'm seeing is companies maybe modifying that. So Barbara, what are you saying?
Yeah, so Tabitha, I'm seeing very similar things. Just a couple of things to note. So these $1,000 and $5,000 thresholds, those are vested account balances. So, you know, when you look at the population and how many individuals might be affected, you're only looking at their vested account, not their total account. The other thing to really keep in mind here is what's the timing on your distributions? Because if you have an ESOP that is written with the traditional most restrictive timing, which would be essentially the 6th year after termination, you know, you can really push that distribution many years out. A plan that has language that says we're going to start paying somebody out or offering payout in the year following termination, you would still need to offer these participants a distribution. At that point in time, it would probably be substantially equal installments or a lump sum, depending upon what your plan document says, but at least you don't have to pay them. If they don't respond, you can keep the monies in the trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. So that is cash out, and feel free to you know, add questions in the comment section. I know Matt's keeping an eye on those, so we'll definitely hit what we can. So any clarifications as Barbara and I banter back and forth here, we're happy to clarify. Diversifications is another I call cash flow item for a plan sponsor. So at this point in the year, you probably have gotten through initial notice on diversification if you're a calendar year, a December 31 plan year. So there's less, I think, to do in terms of diversification at this point in the year. But there was certainly, diversification was one of those questions around, do I need an interim evaluation? I have gotten fewer questions now about diversification, but that is one of those items that you do want to keep your eye on. I think definitely for 2021 cash flow purposes, and obviously all of these things are being funded through contributions to the ESOP in most companies, some companies are doing redemptions, and we'll touch on how that is impacting PPP at the end. Anything that you're getting on diversification, Barbara?
Yeah, so a couple of things, Tabitha. A lot of clients actually adopted the language from that LRM a couple of years ago. So they haven't even thought about their diversifications because they're using that language that says we'll offer them within 90 days of receipt of the fair market value. So for some
So
clients,
they haven't gotten their value yet. They haven't actually.
exactly. Or this is just starting to come up in the conversation. The one thing that we've noticed on some of the plans that have finalized their distribution window is that there are more employees who have taken diversification this year than with their past trends. And I think part of that is related to the fact that many fair market values for 2019 showed really large increases. You know, we saw a lot of clients who had 20-25% increase in the fair market value of their stock. And so I think it has to do with the people who are looking at maybe being out of work, collecting unemployment, and looking at this diversification as a way to get their hands on some of their monies and actually use it for living expenses, versus the traditional idea about diversification, which is just to kind of diversify your assets from employer stock. So certainly that's causing a much larger cash flow now than in the future.
The elections are higher than what we've seen historically. That really leads really nicely, thank you, Barbara, into the CARES Act, because I think the concept and the questions that we get around some of the changes that the CARES Act offered didn't necessarily require really play into that issue that the only access ESOP participants have to their balances generally while they're still what we call in service or actively employed by the company is through diversification, really. There's really no other way for an active employee to get liquidity from their ESOP account until termination. But the CARES Act offered and increased the number of questions we got. It's a good way to keep an ESOP lawyer in business, by the way. Thank you. Added the opportunity for employers to add a feature that allowed for in-service distribution amounts. I think my advice to our ESOP companies has been that that would be silly unless there are some exceptions. There's always an exception to the rule, but silly because there's no liquidity generally in the ESOP. Some ESOPs do have a good amount of cash, but I think those are fewer, and question whether they want to give access to that cash right now. But most ESOPs are holding company stock, and so if you added an in-service distribution feature, that means the company has to come up with the cash to fund those in-service elections. So it was more intended, I think, to allow, the act was more intended to allow 401k participants the ability to take those monies on a tax favored basis, because there is liquidity there, right? There is a investment account somewhere, and so it's not coming out of the company's cash, it's coming out of an investment in some other company that our ESOP sponsors don't have to worry about. So that whole change by the act wasn't really intended to apply to ESOPs. And so I think most, if not all of the companies I work with did not add that feature to their plan, and it was not automatic. So in order to add this CARES Act in-service or hardship distribution feature, you had to amend your plan, or will have to. You could actually use this feature and amend it in the future, but you have to do something affirmative to your plan in order to utilize that feature. Barbara, you want to touch on the other features of the CARES Act?
Sure. So, in addition, there were some loan features, and we have very few ESOPs that actually have loan features within them because, again, you have the same cash flow problems, right? An ESOP rarely has cash because they are required to primarily invest in employer stock. And one of our kind of guiding conversations with plan sponsors is, if you were to offer some sort of loan or other distribution from the ESOP, what happens? Let's assume that Matt, Tabitha, and I all want to take the $100,000 in-service withdrawal or take a loan, and the plan has $150,000. So Tabitha, you're first in line, you want $100,000, and they give it to you. Well, I'm number 2, the plan has $50,000 left, and they give that to me, and Matt, sorry, there's nothing left for you. So it's really difficult for a plan sponsor to manage that when there isn't cash there. Besides, they say, okay, well, what if I put in more cash? Then we'd have many compliance issues related to either annual additions on an individual basis or employer contribution maximum limits under 404. So from a realistic standpoint, it's just not logical in the ESOP world. I don't have any standalone ESOPs that chose to adopt these provisions. We do have some KSOPs that have adopted these provisions, but they're only allowing the withdrawal from the 401k source monies. So it might be their deferrals, Roth, match, those types of accounts that are directly invested by the participants or the employer. I think the other big thing that happened with the CARES Act is required minimum distributions. And, this certainly has been confusing for many participants and plan sponsors, because the CARES Act allows you to cease required minimum distributions for the 2020 plan year. Many plans, by the time the CARES Act had been adopted, had paid delayed RMDs related to 2019 plan year ends that were due by April 1st. But there's also the opportunity, if a plan sponsor wishes, to say, we're actually going to allow you to take your RMD. You just have the option to roll it over. So we are seeing a lot of questions about that, as well as whether, should we do this? Should we not do that? Tabitha, I'm sure you're getting a lot of questions about that. And I think it's important to make sure that we're, documenting the actual practice that a plan sponsor uses.
Yeah, and one just footnote on the CARES Act changes is to make sure that whatever you do, you communicate to your third-party administrator, and then the team certainly communicates it to your ESOP lawyer so that we can make sure that all of the operations of the plan eventually match the plan terms. That's one of the, I think, mismatches when these acts come out, when new legislation is passed and they sort of give us this window where they say, oh, you can do this for the next 2 years, but you don't actually have to amend the terms of your plan until 2 years later. They give a sort of delayed deadline. And the really difficult part of that is if you're not talking to your ESOP lawyer, you're only talking to your third-party administrator, you might sort of miss the window for amending, and now we got a whole correction issue on our hands. So just keeping those lines of communication flowing if you do make any of those changes. And surely all of the wonderful ESOP lawyers of the world will be in contact with their clients in the near term to start doing some amendments. And we have certainly a couple of them stacked up here from all this change in legislation. So. All right, moving off of this slide, let's talk about partial plan termination. I think something and what I typically hear, and I'm sure, Barbara, I'm gonna definitely turn this one over to you because you love this stuff, but I think where this pops up is as a surprise, right? So I always hear about this from companies when they're like, remember back in 2016, we learned our lesson the hard way. We had no idea this thing existed. And all of a sudden, our third-party administrator was finishing our administration and they said, oh, surprise, you have a partial plan termination. So we are hoping by getting this out there that companies will be thinking about this if you have to do layoffs, just be cognizant that this could impact your plan. So with that, Barbara, tell us more.
Thanks, Tabitha. So, one thing I'd like to just start off by saying is that when we're talking about partial plan terminations today, we're really talking about looking forward into the future, right? Most companies, as of 12/31/19, if you were a calendar year end, or even if you were maybe a 3/31/20 plan year end, all of the effects of COVID had not come into play. So business was going on as normal. So we're really looking at partial plan terminations as something that will be happening over the next year to year and a half. The language about how to calculate and address a partial plan termination is really old. It's in Revenue Ruling 2007-43. Tabitha, I think that, you know, your kids might have even been born by then, right?
They were, yeah.
So, you know, we've waited a long time for any changes to this, but really what it means is that if you have an employer-initiated reduction in workforce of 20% or more, that a partial plan termination will have been triggered. And so this would include any COVID-19 related terminations. And just to be clear, we're talking about terminations. We're not talking about saying, oh, we furloughed a bunch of employees and we're systematically bringing them back as we reopen. These are actual terminations. And the testing typically occurs on the last day of the plan year. However, if you read the revenue ruling, it talks about the fact that it could be a single 12-month measurement period. So just because you're a December 31st plan year end doesn't necessarily mean that the only time you test this is the next December. It could be on a rolling period based upon maybe when you needed to close your business due to stay-at-home orders or other factors that played into it. The other important thing to think about when you're calculating this turnover rate, and this is something that us TPAs, you know, this is what we do. This is, give us the numbers. We love doing this. But we're only looking at plan participants. So we're not looking at your population as a whole. And the turnover rate's really calculated by looking at the number of participants who had an employer-initiated severance. So if you have a layoff, if you close a division that affects a large number of employees, they would count in that numerator. And then the denominator is actually the number of participants as of the beginning of the plan year. So in essence, you'd look at your 5,500 count from the prior plan year and add in a new entrance on January 1st. And you do that calculation, if it's 20% or more, you've triggered a partial plan termination. And the consequence of that is 100% vesting for those employees who were involuntarily terminated. So if somebody was 20% vested, they'd been there 2 years. When you had that layoff, they automatically become 100% vested. It has no effect on the timing of their distribution. It has an effect on the amount because they now have a higher vested percent. So Tabitha, have you been getting a lot of questions about partial terminations and, you know, trying to do this on the back of an envelope?
No, I don't crunch numbers. So I take the questions about who's included and who's not. But I think a couple of the specific questions that I've been getting is around that 20% number, right? Trying to figure out, is that hard and fast? And there's really no like black and white line on that. I think even if you were at 19%, the IRS could still come in and say you have a partial plan, but we use that 20% as our guideline. One of the interesting questions on partial plan that I've gotten, not just this year, but in the past is, construction companies are a good example of a company, an industry where the company is probably making terminations just as a part of the business cycle. It's just they hire up for a job, and then when that job is done, those people are terminated. It's just part of the cycle of the business. And those people, if you can show and substantiate that that is part of how the business operates, those people would not be included, right, Barbara? And the number that you're including in the employer-initiated severance, you can sort of parse those guys out and gals. But you definitely want to keep good records to show that that's sort of the cycle that the company undergoes as a part of its business operations. So I've gotten that one a couple of times. And really just this question of around the 12 months that you've mentioned, sort of, is it just the 12-month plan year? Unfortunately, it can sort of span into, if it's related to the same event, right, it can span into additional plan year period.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's a great point, Tabitha, that, you know, if you had a series of layoffs that spanned over a 12-month period, because they're all related, they actually count. But the employer that's a construction company, that's a great point as well, because we actually see plans who every year would have a greater than 30% turnover. But if it's the nature of the business and you can substantiate that those numbers essentially look that way on an annual basis, and that even though the employer may be quote unquote initiating it because of jobs, it's really related to the contracts they're working on, things of that nature. Appropriate documentation really helps out there. The other thing to plan sponsors is it's always good to be noting whether a termination is voluntary or involuntary, because when you get into situations where you really need to crunch the numbers, and we're looking at employer initiated. So if you have an employer-initiated termination due to cause, but you're kind of spanning that partial plan termination number, that person would most likely fall into the numerator, which is sometimes problematic for plan sponsors, especially if the cause was pretty bad and they go from 0 or 20% vested to 100.
So one question came in about a topic a little bit earlier, but RMDs. So what if a participant requests an RMD when it is not in the plan? Does the CARES Act require us to address it, or is the answer no, not in the plan?
So I believe that RMDs are regulatory under Code Section 401A9, and I'm not sure I've ever seen a plan document that doesn't have RMD language.
Yeah, no, it's required. Every document has to. It's one of those, if you talk about boilerplate provisions, that would be boilerplate. The IRS won't give you a determination letter if you don't have the 401A9 language in it. So
okay.
I think that answers the question. But if it didn't, let us know.
Yeah, and certainly, they could choose to offer an RMD in a CARES Act year. They would just make sure that it gets amended properly to indicate that that's what they chose to do for that year.
Yeah. All right. Are we good with partial plan termination, Barbara?
I am. Are you?
I am perfect. Moving on. All right. Investment of non-company stock assets. So not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know that there are fewer ESOP companies that try to sort of stockpile cash in their plans, whether we call that a sinking fund. Segregated assets, however, would fall into this, right? So if you have segregation or you're converting that stock to cash when somebody terminates, you're going to have some cash or non-company stock assets in the ESOP. And so I think what we're seeing, we've historically seen that as being an area potentially open to litigation, right? And so in the 401k plan world, for example, this is definitely an area. How those monies are invested is definitely an area where companies can see some exposure for value to diversify the investments. We see that less, I think, in ESOPs. However, as our ESOPs start to accumulate much higher balances of non-company stock assets because of the segregated accounts, and given this pandemic and the volatility of the markets, we're expecting that there could be some greater subject or focus, we'll say, on the non-company stock assets. I am not trying to get anybody in trouble. I'm trying to help you. So what we want you to do is pay attention, right? So dust off your plan document. Hopefully you already have an investment policy if you have cash in the plan, and just make sure that you have those up to snuff, right? If you have something other than company stock in your ESOP, if you have cash that's being invested or held in an account somewhere, you definitely should have an investment policy. That investment policy can be very simple if you had, for example, $2,000 that's just sitting in an account. But if you have non-company stock assets, you should have an investment policy. That trustee should definitely have a policy. Now I say trustee, but the first point is subject to the requirements of diversification. But the first question is, who is responsible for the diversification? And that can differ from plan to plan. So as a default, generally, the trustee of the ESOP is responsible for investment of plan assets, right? They're protected or excluded, I should say, from the diversification requirements when the plan is invested in company stock, because that is the point of an ESOP, to be invested in company stock. But to the extent that there is other stuff in the ESOP, the trustee is responsible as a default for making sure that there is an appropriate diversification of those assets, and or there's a reason why they're not invested. And that very well could be, we have $2,000 in the plan, we're going to use it in 6 months for distributions. And so what the heck do you want me to invest it in, right? For a 6-month period, it has to be liquid. So there are reasons why those monies might not be diversified in a bunch of different assets. So the first question is figure out who's responsible. There are other plans where it's not the trustee. The trustee may have delegated, or the plan administrator may have delegated that authority or responsibility to an investment manager. It could be that the trustee is directed by a committee, might be a committee of the board of directors of the ESOP sponsor. So it's really important to understand first who has that responsibility, so that you know who is going to get tagged if there's a question, and then make sure that that individual or committee has really documented that investment policy. And like I said, it can be really simple, but it's really important to have one. It is one of the documents that if a participant wants to ask for documentation around the plan, just like they're able to get a copy or review the plan document, they can also request and get a copy of the investment policy because it is part of the plan. Note that different assets within the plan might have different investment delineations. So an investment policy might have a section on the cash that's in the plan and being used for distributions and diversifications and would not be invested in anything, and a separate section for the investment of segregation, right? Because those assets might be held for a much longer period of time. So there could be different investment platforms for both of, or directive for both of those different sections of the plan. And there could be more than that, depending on what the plan has broken the assets down into. Trustees, certainly if whoever is responsible, whether it's the trustee, a committee, whoever it might be, really, especially right now, I would say give really serious consideration to who is responsible. And if you do have a lot of cash assets in the plan, be sure that you are touching base with an investment advisor, right? No trustee, or at least very few trustees, have that experience. Remember, the fiduciaries are held to a higher standard of prudence. So you want to make sure that you are getting advice and consulting with an investment advisor. And so you have that in the record very periodically. Many companies are doing that maybe once a year or twice a year. I would say definitely during this period of the pandemic, you want to be having on the record that you talk to your investment advisor. Should we make any changes in how we are investing the assets of the ESOP that are not in company stock? Some trustees or fiduciaries have actually outsourced, I'd call it, to an investment manager, and it's their problem. But don't forget that any fiduciary who delegates authority to somebody else, even though that investment manager might have taken on the responsibility as a fiduciary, whoever appointed that investment manager still has the responsibility to monitor. So that still means you got to reach out and have that conversation to make sure that the investment manager has paid attention, right, and is considered what is happening with those assets at the least, at minimum. And then obviously, you know, keeping track of where are the funds held when the markets get a little crazy, ups and downs that we're seeing. You just want to make sure that you're keeping tabs on where those non-company stock assets are at, that they're safe, they don't need to be transferred. We saw, you know, back in the recession, some issues, you know, with companies that went out of business and people lost retirement funds, and we don't want any of our ESOP companies to lose their non-company stock assets. So just be mindful in that regard. So I don't know, Barbara, do you get questions on investment policies at all?
We do, and you know, typically, obviously, we can't give them legal or tax advice, nor do we give investment advice. But you know, we have many plan sponsors who either work with their corporate investment advisors or with the people who help them on the 401k side. So, you know, it's definitely a question that's out there. It's something that we look at, that if we see the assets in a plan start to grow, maybe they've been accumulating a fair amount of S-Corp distribution, something of that nature. You know, we do advise a plan sponsor that they really need to start thinking about this and making sure that they're crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So I think this is great advice. Thanks for giving it, Tabitha.
Hey, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, on to a totally different topic. Let's talk about allocation requirements. We have about just under 20 minutes here. So Barbara, you want to give us some insight on what companies should be thinking about when it comes to allocation requirements?
Sure. So this really comes into play because we've had a lot of plan sponsors who unfortunately have been affected by the COVID-19 and been forced to close their doors for extended periods of time. And so it's not just the question of, gee, do you think I'm going to have a partial plan termination, or what should I do about my distribution policy this year? But it's a bigger picture of saying, what happens for the 2020 plan year? You know, I typically have used a provision in my plan document that says someone must work 1,000 hours and be employed on the last day of the plan year in order to receive an allocation. You know, and there's always exceptions for death, disability, and attainment of retirement, but we're talking about just the vast majority of the employees. And many plan sponsors are concerned that if I've been closed for 3 months, maybe I'm not going to have people who hit their 1,000 hours this year because they're, you know, I've been closed 3 months, I'm opening up slow, people are working less hours because we're job sharing. You know, how do I ensure that everyone I want to get the contribution gets it? And so, you know, this has been a conversation that's come up with many plan sponsors. Tabitha, I think you and I have had it with shared clients of, you know, really looking at this and saying, well, how many people are going to be affected, and is there a way around it? And there is a way around it. Unfortunately, we're getting late in the year to maybe address this on some plans, but if you have participants who have not yet met your allocation requirements, so if you have 1,000 hours, if you don't have anyone today who has actually been credited with 1,000 hours, you still have a window of time to change the plan. Maybe lower that hours requirement, maybe remove it altogether. But this all comes into play because remember, you've got an allocation at 2020 plan year end. It's going to typically be based on compensation. Compensation will be lower. There may be less people who've reached the hours or employment on the last day. So you really want to get in front of this and start thinking about it and amending it. Tabitha, you have any other thoughts?
Perfect. Nope, you took the words right out of my mouth. Perfect.
All right. Should we talk about
Awesome.
PPP for a few minutes?
Let's talk about PPP. I brought my mask for the PPP. I haven't. Let's do it. So I just want to say, first of all, big apology because I know the question. I get the question every day from a company, which is how much of the contribution, right, or my amount of my distributions, like how much of what I need to put in the plan this year can I use to count towards forgiveness? And we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth in a minute, but I just want to say if you waited for this entire presentation for us to answer that question, I'm so sorry because we don't know. We are still waiting for official guidance from the SBA to give greater specificity, a better, what are they going to accept? What are they not going to accept? So we'll tell you what we think, but unfortunately, we are not where the buck stops on this one. And so it's not going to be the final answer. So if that was what you were looking for today, bye-bye. But
Don't go.
oh, don't go. Ask questions. Yes. So yeah, really, a couple of minutes here, and hopefully you all have some questions on stuff that you want to hear about too. But really, obviously under the CARES Act, Paycheck Protection Program provides these loans to companies, and there are limitations on who can participate. But I've heard from a good majority, maybe more than that, of our clients have actually, our ESOP clients have definitely received some form of PPP loan, some amount. And so, we have this 8-week period that starts from the time you get the PPP loan and actually have the cash. You have 8 weeks to sort of abide by the rules and figure out how much you can spend on payroll, and then a little bit of additional amounts that aren't payroll but are as required by the Act. And then you get to determine how much of that PPP loan gets to be forgiven based on essentially bringing back people on your payroll, right? So this whole thing was intended to get companies to keep people on payroll so that they didn't have to be on unemployment, essentially. And so the primary question that we're seeing is one of the pieces that the loans are intended to pay for is for retirement payments, right? That's part of payroll costs, according to the legislation. But what we don't know is, can I take my retirement contributions, whether that's 401k plan, whether that's ESOP, from later periods in the year? I know I need to make my ESOP contribution to pay my ESOP loan in December, but can I pay that now and use that, count that towards my payroll costs for purposes of the forgiveness aspect? I think you're safe using those amounts towards an appropriate use of the loan funds. I don't think anyone would question that, but we don't want to just use the funds. We want to have free use of the funds. So let's get it forgiven. And that's the piece that we really just don't know whether it has to be a prorated portion for those 8 weeks, out of the entirety of the year, or whether more is going to be allowed. There are also questions around, and Barbara, I'm curious to hear what you were telling your clients as well, questions around, do I actually have to make the contribution, or is it just enough that I can accrue the contribution because I know I'm going to have to make these distributions. So I know I'm going to have to put those dollars into the plan. Can I just accrue for it? We're certainly saying if you're going to have to put it in the plan anyways, just put it in the plan now during that 8-week period, so you don't have to play guessing games and guess wrong, essentially. So that's where we're sort of, we can give you all of the sort of conservative, play it safe. The end of the day, I think, Barbara, you were in on a webinar as well, where the SBA basically said, look, we don't know ESOPs. You know, they've been in our legislation for years, but you call an SBA person and they don't even know the first thing about ESOPs. So when they put this together, they were not thinking about ESOP contributions and ESOP loans and how those things operate and could be impacted by the forgiveness calculations. So I don't think there is necessarily an answer that anyone at SBA knows right now. So we typically are just trying to be conservative, which is what the SBA person indicated. Like, just think about the intent of the program, be conservative so you can support taking the amount as a piece of the forgiveness. You know, don't get greedy, essentially was the commentary. So Barbara, what are you telling your clients?
Yeah, so of course, Tabitha, we always want to defer to legal counsel and at least bring them into the conversation, right? But in general, we've got lots of clients calling us and saying, hey, can you run some preliminary numbers as to what my maximum contribution could be? Can you tell me what my projected distribution or diversification amounts are, even though we don't have a stock value yet? So, you know, we're doing a lot of those calculations to help provide some of the parameters of what the maximum amounts might be. But the other thing that, you know, we're really seeing with respect to the ESOP loan payments is most plans are written that they have a one-time annual principal and interest payment on a leveraged loan. And typically that's pretty close to the end of the plan year. So, you know, they usually go through what we call the round robin expensing of the funds, meaning they put in their principal and interest payment in the morning, and in the afternoon, it magically appears back in the company books. And the real question has been for us, if I make this contribution, does it need to sit there until the end of the plan year? Or can I actually make the contribution and go through my normal round robin kind of expensing of that money back to the company? Because many times plan sponsors don't have $1 million to sit for the next 6 months kind of waiting. So I think we look at it in two different ways. Most of the attorneys I've worked with have said you can round robin that money back to the company. So at least you've got the record trail just like you normally would any other year. You've physically made a contribution and then you've paid your loan payment. Now, if these are monies with respect to stockpiling cash for future distributions, we've really advised clients that if they want to potentially get some sort of credit when the information is available under PPP, that those funds should be deposited to the trust now and just sit there until the time that we actually make distribution payments this year.
One of the variables, I'll call it, in ESOP distributions, Barbara, as you know so well, is some of our companies will redeem shares instead of transferring cash to the ESOP and recycling, right? So instead of the ESOP writing the check to the participant in a redemption, the company is actually writing the check to the participant. Our position at this point is that it's a little bit harder to substantiate that if a distribution is paid by the company. I think there's certainly an argument because you're still paying those funds as part of the put option to pay out the retirement plan benefit for the value of those shares. But when we think about the complexity of educating the SBA on the various types of distribution that teams have, I would much prefer to just basically show them evidence that I made a contribution to the ESOP trust itself versus trying to get them to understand and showing them distribution forms, you know, to sort of substantiate that that was a payment for redemption of shares that came out of the ESOP. So, and we still don't have an answer to that really specifically either. But if you have the choice, I think between, while you're doing your distributions right now, between doing a contribution or doing redemptions, it's certainly going to be easier, I think, to substantiate for SBA contribution to fund those distributions. But I know some companies don't have the ability to make that choice. There are some limitations that they run into. So I don't know if you've had any of those questions.
We haven't actually seen many questions with relation to a distribution according to the put option rules, like you're saying. So, you know,
Yep.
typically those funds never hit the ESOP, even for plans where we might have a paying agent account. We have 2 paying agent accounts, one for the stock distributions, which are being funded through the company, and a second for any distributions that are being funded through recycling or employer contributions. So I think that's a really tricky area. I would agree with you that I think this is going to take a significant amount of education, as well as plan sponsors really documenting what's been done, right? I think having appropriate documentation always helps when you're trying to prove a point in order to, for whatever reason, you know, but anytime that you have to substantiate what you've done, having that documentation behind it with appropriate records is very important.
Yep, absolutely. And obviously the more simple for SBA purposes, the better.
Absolutely. It would be an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we are coming up on the hour. So if anyone else who's been listening has a question you'd like to toss towards Tabitha and or Barbara, now would be a good time to do it before we kind of move into a quick wrap up. And if anyone wants to ask a question in person, you know, just raise your hand and I can sort of add you as well. So we have a thank you, Tabitha, Barbara, and Matt. Dave Fitzgerald, thank you for attending.
You're welcome, Dave.
Any other questions folks have? Just give a moment and then maybe ask for your final thoughts.
Yeah, the hand raising thing, the feature where you like raise your hand is a little tricky. So I know Matt's really good at that, but I'm not very good at that.
I can raise my hand. Okay, one more in the chat. Yeah. Also, thanks from Chris Moran. So, yes. Oh, so slide deck. Is the slide deck available?
So definitely make that available. Yeah.
Great. So, yeah, I can. I'm gonna, for the folks who are part of the Employee Ownership Vermont group, I will. I'll post a link to the video to the thread, and I'll also attach the slide deck to that post as well.
Yeah, and feel free to email Barbara or myself. Our contact information, which I could show to you, I guess, is maybe is in here. So of course, in order to get it, you would actually have to email us first. So in any event, I'll take a minute on mine and I'll take a minute on yours, Barbara. Feel free to email either one of us if you have questions and follow up on any of these topics, and or just want the PowerPoint slides if you can't get them through.
Great. So
process there, and we're happy to give those to you.
Yeah. So any last word, final thought, Barbara, just in terms of, you know, things that might still be coming up or that you'd recommend to folks?
Yeah, so I think things are changing every week still. And, you know, certainly we tell our plan sponsors, don't be afraid to ask questions. This is all complex. It's all different. And, you know, we're just here to answer any questions. So certainly, as Tabitha said, if something comes up, feel free to give me a call, send me an email. Happy to help however we can.
Great. And final thought, Tabitha.
No, just everybody hang in there, and don't forget your masks, and we'll hopefully see you in August at the full day conference that Matt is currently planning. So keep your eyes open for that.
We'll be pushing out
virtually.
we'll be pushing out the registration information probably in the next week. But in the meantime, just August 18th, mark your calendars, and we'll have some good opportunities for discussion, and I think some quite relevant sessions there. So great. Well, thank you both. I'll stop the recording now.